The Wyoming sky stretched endless and blue above the struggling ranch, fast enough to make a person feel both small and strangely capable all at once. Lyle Rourke stood on the porch of her weathered farmhouse, her toddler daughter Ivy balanced on her hip, watching the dust rise from the road as another vehicle approached. She knew what it meant before the truck even pulled into the yard. Another letter, another threat, another deadline pressing closer. Lila carried the kind of beauty that still held traces of her youth, though the past couple of years had etched weariness into her features. Her long auburn hair stayed tucked in a practical braid down her back. She wore a plaid flannel shirt tucked into one jeans, boots that had walked to many hard days, and a tan cowboy hat that had once belonged to her late husband. Wyatt, Ivy, with her blonde curls and wide blue eyes, wore pink overalls and tiny brown boots Lila had found at the thrift store in town, the ranch. 300 acres of grassland and memories had belonged to Wyatt's family for generations. They had married in the happy early years filled with plans and dreams. Then Wyatt died in a ranching accident, a horse spooked by a rattlesnake, a sudden fall, a head injury, and he was gone in an instant. He left Lila with an infant daughter and a ranch she barely knew how to run. She had tried. God knew she had tried. She hired help whenever she could afford it, learned to fix fences and tend cattle, worked from sunrise until long after dark. But the ranch had already been struggling before Wyatt's death, and the medical bills combined with funeral costs had buried her in debt. The bank was circling, ready to foreclose. Then there was the Preston Caldwell problem. He owned the massive ranch that bordered hers, thousands of acres of prime cattle land. He had wanted the Rourke property for years, and now that she was a widow barely holding on, he had intensified the pressure. Yet the real danger wasn't just his offers to buy her out. It was the water rights. The creek that ran through her land was the only reliable water source for miles. Wyatt's great-grandfather had secured those rights a century ago, and they remained ironclad as long as a direct family member actively worked the property. But Lila had discovered a clause in the original agreement. If the land was sold or if no direct family member maintained residence and operation of the ranch, the water rights would revert to the adjacent landowners, meaning Caldwell. Her lawyer had been clear. The county board was reviewing the case. Caldwell argued that as a widow with a small child, she was not actively working the ranch in the spirit of the original agreement. He had petitioned to have the water rights transferred. The best defense would be to show stable family operation, ideally with a spouse who had demonstrated ranching experience. I don't have a spouse, Lila had said bitterly. Mine died. I know, the lawyer replied gently. But the hearing is approaching. If you can't demonstrate stable family operation by then, she didn't need him to finish. She would lose the ranch, lose the water rights, lose everything Wyatt's family had built. She would have to move to town, find work she was barely qualified for, and raise Ivy in an apartment instead of these wide open spaces. That reality had brought her to this moment, and to the man now climbing out of a dusty pickup truck in her driveway, Silas. Reed was a man of few words, and that was putting it generously. Dark hair just beginning to grey at the temples framed a withered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His deep brown eyes missed nothing. He wore a dark denim shirt, jeans, a worn leather belt with a simple buckle, and a grey cowboy hat that had seen better days. Tall and lean, he carried the quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of physical labor. Lila had met him months earlier when her tractor broke down in the north pasture. Silas worked as a ranch hand for the Thompson spread some miles to the south. He had been helping move cattle through the area when he saw her struggling with the engine. He spent time fixing it, speaking barely a dozen words, then tipped his hat and left before she could properly thank him. Since then she had seen him occasionally at the feed store, at the diner, and once at the hardware store where he helped her load fencing supplies without being asked. He never started conversations, rarely made eye contact, and seemed to prefer the company of horses to people. But he was a skilled rancher. Everyone in the county knew that. And recently, in a moment of desperation, Lila had approached him at the diner and asked the most impossible question she had ever posed to anyone. I need a husband, she said bluntly, sliding into the booth across from him. Not a real one. A paper one. To save my ranch, Silas looked up from his coffee, his expression unreadable. She explained the situation, the water rights, the hearing approaching, Caldwell's pressure, the need for someone with ranching credentials to move onto the property and work it with her, to show the county board a legitimate family operation. She couldn't pay much. She was barely keeping her head above water, but she could offer room and board, and she was desperate. If she lost this ranch, she lost everything Wyatt had built. Ivor's inheritance. Silas remained silent for so long that she thought he would refuse. Then he said, "I'll think about it. The hearing is approaching." She pressed. "I'll let you know soon," he replied, returning his attention to his coffee. Now, days later, he stood in her driveway. Lila felt her heart pounding. She adjusted Ivy on her hip and walked down the porch steps to meet him. "Mr. Reed, Silas," he corrected quietly. It might have been the longest single word she had ever heard him speak. "Right, Silas." She took a breath. "Have you thought about my proposal?" "I have." He looked out across the ranch, the rolling grassland, the distant cattle, the old barn that needed paint, the fences that needed mending. "You're in over your head." It wasn't a question. Her cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "I'm managing. You're drowning," Silas said, not unkindly. "You've got cattle that need moving to better pasture. Your north fence is down. Quotes are going to be a problem. That barn needs structural work before winter. And your equipment is held together with baling wire and prayer. I know all that," Lila said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That's why I need help. That's why I'm asking you." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "Why me?" "Because you're a good rancher," she answered honestly. "Because you're single. Because you don't seem to care much what people think. And because you helped me fix my tractor without asking for anything in return. That told me you were decent. I need decent more than I need anything else right now." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "A marriage on paper?" Lila nodded. "We'd file for license, have a simple ceremony, whatever's legally required. You'd move onto the ranch, work it with me, help me get it back on its feet. In exchange, I'd provide room and board. And when we've secured the water rights and satisfied the county board, we'd quietly divorce. Clean. Simple. Temporary. Nothing about this is simple," Silas observed. "No," she agreed. "But it's the only option I have left. What about your daughter?" "Ivy stays with me," Lila said firmly. "Always. That's non-negotiable. You'd have your own room, your own space. This would be a business arrangement. Nothing more." Silas was quiet again, weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, he said, "I have conditions." Hope flared in her chest. "I work the ranch my way," he continued. "You don't have to agree with every decision, but I need the authority to make calls about cattle, pasture, equipment. I won't undermine you, but I won't be a hired hand taking orders either. Fair. I keep my own money. What little there is," Silas went on. "I'm not looking to take advantage of this situation financially. When we split, I walk away with what I came with, of course, and nobody knows this is fake," he said, his voice firm. "Not your friends, not your family, not the people in town. If we're going to do this, we do it right. As far as anyone knows, we fell for each other, got married, and we're making a go of the ranch together. The moment people suspect this is a sham, the county board will use it against you." A chill ran down Lila's spine. She hadn't fully considered that part, the lying, the pretense, the deception. But he was right. If Caldwell or anyone else suspected the marriage wasn't genuine, it would all be for nothing. "Agreed," she said quietly. "One more thing." Silas looked directly at her now, and she saw something in his eyes she couldn't quite name. "I won't have people thinking I'm taking advantage of a widow or mistreating a child. I'll be respectful to you and kind to your daughter in public and in private. That's who I am. But I also won't pretend to be something I'm not. I'm not talkative. I'm not social. I don't make friends easily. People are going to think you married a strange, quiet man. You need to be okay with that." "I can live with quiet," Lila said. I've been living with lonely. Quiet sounds peaceful by comparison. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. When do you want to do this? As soon as possible. We need to be established as a married couple operating the ranch together before the hearing. I'll need to give notice at Thompson's place, Silas said. In the coming weeks, then. I'll move my things here. We can go to town soon for the license. Thank you, Lila said, and Tess pricked her eyes despite her best effort to stay composed. Thank you. You're saving our lives. Don't thank me yet, Silas replied. We haven't accomplished anything yet. And Mrs. Rourke, this is going to be harder than you think. He was right about that. They were married soon afterward at the county courthouse, with Ivy as their only witness along with the court clerk who processed the paperwork. Lila wore a simple blue dress she had found in her closet. Nothing special. Silas wore what he always wore: jeans, a button-down shirt, his one belt and hat. The ceremony took less than a few minutes. You may kiss the bride, the justice of the peace said. Lila and Silas looked at each other awkwardly. They hadn't discussed this part. Finally, Silas leaned in and pressed a brief, respectful kiss to her cheek. It was over before she could even process it. And just like that, she was married again to a man she barely knew. For all the wrong reasons, Silas moved into the ranch that afternoon, carrying 2 duffel bags and a wooden box that looked handmade. Lila showed him to the spare bedroom, the one that had been Wyatt's office, though she had cleared it out because walking past it every day hurt too much. It's not much, she said, gesturing to the small room with its single bed, dresser, and window overlooking the south pasture. It's fine, Silas said, setting down his bags. Ivy, who had been shy around him at first, peeked around the doorframe. Are you going to live here now? She asked in her small voice. Silas knelt so he was at her eye level. I am. Is that okay with you? Ivy considered this seriously. Do you like horses? I do, he said. Okay, Ivy decided. You can stay. Silas's mouth twitched again in that almost smile. Thank you. That's very generous. The first weeks were awkward. Lila and Silas moved around each other like dancers who hadn't learned the choreography. Polite but distant, cordial but careful. Silas was up before dawn every day, working the ranch with a competence that left her both grateful and humbled. He fixed the knot fence, moved the cattle to better pasture, repaired equipment she hadn't even realized was broken. He worked with a quiet efficiency that reminded her of Wyatt. Though the two men were nothing alike in personality, Silas rarely spoke unless spoken to. He ate meals with Lila and Ivy, but contributed little to conversation. He was patient with Ivy when she chatted at him, and Ivy did chatter, seemingly determined to fill every silence with words, but he responded mostly in nods and brief affirmatives. At night he retreated to his room. Lila would hear him moving around occasionally, but mostly there was just silence. Ivy felt strange having someone else in the house again. Strange and lonely in a different way than being actually alone. The people in town noticed the marriage immediately, of course. Small town gossip being what it was. Everyone had an opinion. Awful quick, isn't it? Lila heard someone whisper at the feed store. Wyatt's barely been gone. She needed help with the ranch, someone else said. Can't blame her for being practical. That Silas Reed is a strange one. Another voice added. Barely says 2 words. What's she thinking? Marrying him? Lila kept her head high and ignored them. Silas predictably didn't seem to notice or care what people thought. But Preston Caldwell noticed. He showed up at the ranch one afternoon driving his expensive truck, wearing his expensive clothes, looking like money and privilege. Mrs. Rourke, he said, then corrected himself with a smirk. Excuse me, Mrs. Reed now, isn't it? Congratulations on your marriage. Very sudden. What do you want, Preston? Lila asked. She was standing on the porch while Silas worked in the barn within earshot. She saw him pause, watching. Just being neighborly, Caldwell said. Wanted to meet your new husband. Silas Reed, isn't it? Heard he's a ranch hand from Thompson's place. Interesting choice. Silas is my husband and my partner, Lila said firmly. And this ranch is staying in my family. We'll see, Caldwell replied. County board hearing is approaching. I'll be very interested to see if the board believes this convenient arrangement constitutes genuine family operation. He tipped his hat mockingly and left. Lila felt her hands shaking. Silas emerged from the barn and walked over. He's going to challenge the marriage at the hearing, I know, she said. He'll say it's fake, that I'm just a hired hand you married on paper. I know. Silas looked at her. Then we need to be convincing starting now. Over the following days, Silas and Lila made a point of being seen together in town. They went to the feed store together, to the diner for lunch, to church on Sunday. Silas held doors for her, carried Ivy on his shoulders, stood close enough that people would notice. He didn't reach for her hand that seemed a step too far for both of them, but he was present, attentive in his quiet way. Ivy helped innocently and unknowingly. She had started calling him Dad, a child's compromise between his name and what he was supposed to be. She would climb onto his lap during dinner, ask him to read her bedtime stories in his quiet, steady voice, follow him around the ranch like a small shadow. And Silas, to his credit, never seemed annoyed or impatient. He answered Ivy's endless questions, let her help with ranch work, taught her the names of the horses. Lila would watch them together and feel something complicated stir in her chest. Gratitude, certainly, but something else too. Something that felt almost like the beginning of family. The county board hearing was held on a morning. Lila wore her best dress, which still wasn't very impressive, and Silas wore a clean shirt and his least worn jeans. They sat together at a table facing the 5-member board, with Caldwell and his expensive lawyers on the other side. Caldwell's attorney laid out their case. Lila Rourke was a widow with no ranching experience attempting to operate a substantial property. The marriage to Silas Reed appeared to be one of convenience, contracted specifically to maintain water rights. Silas Reed was a transient ranch hand with no ownership stake in the property. This did not constitute genuine family operation in the spirit of the original water rights agreement. Then it was their turn. Lila's lawyer presented tax documents showing Silas listed as CEO operator of the ranch, photographs of him working the property, and testimony from neighbors about seeing them together as a family. Lila herself testified about the improvements Silas had made, the work they had done together, and their plans for the ranch's future. Mrs. Reed, one of the board members, said, a woman in her 60s named Evelyn Briggs. I have to ask, your husband is quite a bit older than you. You married very quickly after meeting him. And the timing, right before this hearing, you can understand why it raises questions. Lila felt her face flush, but before she could answer, Silas spoke. It was the first time he had said anything during the entire hearing. Ma'am, I know how this looks, he said, his quiet voice somehow carrying authority. I'm not a talker. Never have been. I'm not the kind of man most women would look at twice. But Mrs. Reed Lila, she looked past that. She saw someone who could help her keep her family's ranch. And I saw a woman working herself to exhaustion, trying to honor her late husband's legacy. We came together for practical reasons. That's true, but practicality doesn't make it less real. He glanced at Lila, and she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like sincerity. She's a good woman, strong, determined, a good mother, the kind of woman worth building a life with. So yes, we married quickly, but we're building something real on that foundation. And we're going to make this ranch thrive. The silence in the room was profound. Even Caldwell's lawyer seemed momentarily speechless. Evelyn Briggs nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Reed. That was illuminating. The board deliberated for some time. When they returned, Evelyn Briggs read the decision. The board finds that the Rourke Ranch is being operated as a genuine family enterprise. Water rights will remain with the current property owners. Mr. Caldwell's petition is denied. Lila felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. Silas's hand was suddenly at her elbow, steady and supporting. They had won. The drive home was quiet, which wasn't unusual for them. But this silence felt different, loaded. Lila kept glancing at Silas, remembering what he had said at the hearing. She's the kind of woman worth building a life with. Had he meant it, or had it just been a performance, saying what needed to be said? Back at the ranch, her sister Lorna was watching Ivy. When they walked in together, Lorna took one look at their faces and grinned. You won? We won, Lila confirmed. Lorna hugged her fiercely. I am so proud of you and Silas. She turned to him. Thank you for helping her. For helping our family. Silas nodded, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Just doing what was right. After Lorna left and Ivy was in bed, Lila found Silas on the porch.